Lighthouses, built to guide ships through the darkness, yet inside their stone walls lurk shadows that never leave. Keepers who spent years in silence reported footsteps echoing on empty stairs, whispers carried by the wind, and lights that refused to die even after their watchers did. These are not just legends. They are the true disturbing tales left behind by those who lived and vanished inside these towers. Tonight, we open the journals, the records, and the secrets the ocean tried to bury. Welcome to Farcical. Fears where the past refuses to stay hidden. If you dare to step deeper into the dark with me, make sure you subscribe, because the next story might be the one that keeps you awake tonight. Let's move to our first story. The Journal of Elias Hart was discovered in the summer of 1927, when the lighthouse on Stone Marrow Point was being prepared for permanent decommission. By then, the town it once served had shrunk to a quiet fishing hamlet. The old families had moved inland, the sea routes had shifted, and the tower had not been manned in nearly 30 years. Most of the structure had been abandoned to salt and rot, but tucked into a desk drawer, beneath a false bottom cleverly built into the wood, was a small leather-bound book. The writing inside was faded, shaky at times, but almost entirely legible. Though not every page was dated, the entries seemed to span a single winter, from October through early December of 1892. What followed was a strange and increasingly disturbing account of one man's life inside a lighthouse he no longer trusted. The first pages were practical, weather notes, tide patterns, brief comments on supplies. But even in these simple records, there was something off in Hart's tone. A sense of unease ran beneath the surface. His handwriting was neat at first, clipped and controlled, but as the pages went on, it grew more jagged, letters leaning as though written in haste. On October 12th, he wrote, "The wind carries voices when it turns from the east. I have checked the door locks 3 times tonight, though no one is here but me. It is an old tower, yes, and wood shifts, but I cannot shake the impression of someone climbing the stairs. The sound is distinct, a measured tread, heavy, deliberate. I tell myself it is the storm playing tricks, but storms do not stop at the 3rd step and then begin again." The following nights brought more of the same. Footsteps, always after midnight, always climbing as if unseen visitors were making their way toward the lantern room. He described pausing his work to listen, hearing the creak of each step, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. He would rush to the stairwell with his lantern, only to find it empty. By October 20th, the writing had grown darker. The footsteps are constant. They begin at 1:13 each night. I tried staying awake, tried waiting for them in silence, lantern snuffed. At first, they kept to their pattern. Tonight, though, they stopped just outside my chamber door. I could hear the wood straining beneath weight. Whoever it was did not knock. They only stood there breathing. I swear by God I heard breath on the other side of the wood. These early entries were unsettling, but still grounded in the tone of a rational man documenting strange events. Yet, as the weeks passed, Hart's grip seemed to loosen. His sentences grew fragmented, his words desperate. October 29th, I barred the stair door tonight, hammered it shut, and still, I heard them climbing. Nails screeched against wood, hinges groaned, but no board gave way. When I flung it open, there was nothing, and yet the air reeked of seawater, as though something dripping and drowned had just stood upon the step. He recorded no visitors, no relief keepers, no supply boats. This too was unusual. Lighthouses were seldom tended by a single man for long stretches, as isolation could erode the strongest mind. Yet Hart seemed entirely alone. His only companions were the waves, the gulls, and the endless sound of unseen steps. On November 2nd, the entries turned personal. It was Margaret's voice, tonight, clear as the day she left this earth. She called my name from the stairwell, soft and kind, asking if I was lonely. I am. God, forgive me, I am. But I know it was not her. She drowned to winters past, and yet the cadence was hers exactly. If I answer, if I so much as whisper back, I fear what I may invite through the door. The handwriting on this page shook violently, the ink blotting as though written with trembling hands. As November deepened, his isolation was compounded by storms. He described waves striking the tower so hard that plaster rained from the ceiling. Supply ships were delayed, leaving his food sparse and his oil reserves dwindling. Still, what tormented him most were the footsteps. Always at 1:13. Never earlier, never later. If I am awake, they come. If I sleep, they come. If I bar the door, they come. Tonight I tried descending instead of climbing, to see if I could meet them on the stairs. But the sound reversed itself. What should have been ascending footsteps became descending ones, keeping always just beyond my sight. They are mocking me. By mid-November, the entries carried an air of desperation. The tower is alive. I know this now. It groans when I breathe, it sighs when I pray. The stones themselves drink my fear. I wake with salt crusted on my lips, though I have not been to the shore in days. At night, the walls seep water. I follow the trickles with my hand, and they lead always to the stairwell, always down. The final pages were the most disturbing. They contained fewer words, more scrawled impressions than full entries. Hart wrote of shadows moving against the lantern glass, though the flame was steady. He claimed the beam no longer obeyed its rotation but lingered, pointing inland, illuminating empty hills. He described voices that shifted between familiar loved ones and guttural strangers, always coaxing him toward the stairs. December 3rd, I went down tonight. I should not have. The door to the cellar was open, though I never unbarred it. The air was foul, brine and rot. The sea does not belong inside stone, and yet it surged beneath the floor. A shape rose with it, tall, dripping, hollow where the face should be. It did not climb. It waited, waiting still perhaps. The next entry was little more than a sentence, scrawled diagonally across the page. The sea wants its keeper back. After this, only fragments remained, half-written words, ink trails veering off the paper. The final mark was not text at all, but a handprint, pressed so hard it tore the paper beneath. When the journal was discovered decades later, the lighthouse was empty. No trace of Hart's body was ever found. Some claimed he fled his post and drowned in the sea, his body swallowed by the waves he feared. Others whispered he had never left the tower at all, that he had become part of it, another voice in the endless stairwell. Another set of footsteps echoing after midnight. To this day, fishermen near Stone Point speak of strange lights that flicker in the abandoned lantern room. They say if you cut your engine and drift close on a quiet night, you can hear the sound of boots on whetstone, climbing, always climbing, toward a door that will never open. Let's move to our second story. The reel was small, no more than 4 inches in diameter, wound in brittle black film that smelled of vinegar and dust. It had been donated to the Maritime History Museum in Greyhaven in 1998, nearly 22 years after its creation. The donor was a fisherman named William Crite, then a man in his late 60s, who claimed he had found the reel among his father's belongings after his death. When asked why he had kept it for so long without sharing it, William's reply was simple: because it frightened him. Frightened him enough that he'd locked it away. The film itself was shot in the summer of 1976 on an 8mm handheld camera, though the quality was grainy and faded by the time museum staff projected it. The images remained sharp enough to capture something William's father had sworn was not of this world. The footage was only 11 minutes long. It began harmlessly, like a home movie. The man behind the camera, later identified as Harold Crite, William's father, can be heard whistling as he climbs the winding steps of an old lighthouse. The date, scribbled on the canister in Harold's hand, was August 14, 1976. The first 3 minutes of footage are entirely mundane. The stairwell is shown in jerky pans, pausing occasionally to focus on cracks in the stone walls or rusting fixtures. At one point, Harold mutters, "Needs work, doesn't it?" Surprised it's still standing. His voice is cheerful, casual, the way one might narrate for friends. But at minute 4, something shifts. The footage shows the lantern room at the top of the tower. The large glass lens dominates the screen, sunlight glinting sharply off its angles. Harold circles the room, humming. His camera lingers on the view beyond the glass. A vast sweep of ocean, horizon blurred in the haze. For a few seconds, everything is perfectly ordinary. Then, without warning, a shadow passes across the glass. The problem is that it doesn't behave like a natural shadow. It is too defined, too human in shape, and there is nothing in the room that could cast it. The light remains steady, no clouds pass, yet the figure stretches, dark and sharp, as though someone were standing just outside the lens. Harold notices it. You can hear his voice falter, mid-sentence. "What the he?" begins, before swinging the camera back toward the steps. Nothing is there. The doorway yawns empty. When he turns back to the lantern glass, the shadow is gone. The next 2 minutes are filled with shakier footage, Harold muttering nervously to himself. He films the lens again, pans across the walls, points the camera down the spiral stairs. The only sound is his breathing. Then, at minute 7, he captures something else. The glass of the lens reflects his own figure faintly, as expected. But there is another figure beside him, pale. Taller than him, by a head at least. Its features are blurred, indistinct, as though the glass refuses to hold them. When Harold moves, his reflection moves, but the other does not. It stands still, watching. He gasps audibly. The camera jerks, and the picture distorts, in violent shakes. For the next 30 seconds, the footage is almost unwatchable. Wild movements, flashes of the floor and ceiling, Harold's ragged breathing, filling the real dot, then the frame steadies again. The lens is now cracked. A long fracture runs diagonally across it, as though struck with a blunt object. Yet there is no sound on the film of such a blow, and Harold himself can be seen reflected, clearly now, alone. His voice returns in a hoarse whisper. "No, no, I saw you. I saw you standing there." The final 2 minutes are the most chilling. Harold ascends the spiral stairs, still filming. His breathing is labored, almost panicked. The camera swings, wildly, showing the damp walls, the iron railing, the uneven steps. Then, faintly, another sound enters the real dot footsteps, not his own. They echo from above, heavy, deliberate, as though someone is following. The problem is that the sound doesn't sync with the movement of his camera. His own boots scrape the stone in one rhythm, but the echoes strike in another. Harold pauses halfway down the stairwell. The camera points upward. For a second there is nothing, just a long spiral fading into shadows. Then, at the very top, a pale figure leans into view. Its proportions are wrong, the head tilted too far, the limbs elongated. It does not move like a person, but more like something sliding into place. The footage cuts abruptly after this frame. No end title, no final comment from Harold, no sound of him leaving the lighthouse. Just black. When the museum staff viewed this reel in 1998, they debated whether it was a hoax. Some argued Harold had staged it with a friend, though the unnatural way the figure moved, jerky yet fluid, was difficult to replicate. Others suggested light artifacts or lens flares. But no one could explain the footsteps, recorded in perfect clarity, separate from Harold's own. The strangest part, however, was what William Cright revealed afterward. According to him, Harold had never been the same after that day. Though he lived another 10 years, he refused to discuss the lighthouse again. He would not visit the sea, would not keep coastal maps in his home, and grew furious when asked about the reel. He would sit awake at night, William said, staring at the ceiling, whispering under his breath. Once, William caught the words, "Still," watching still at the top of the stairs. When Harold died in 1986, he left behind no written account of the event, only the reel itself. William locked it away, too afraid to destroy it, too afraid to see it again. And yet, those who viewed it in the museum screening reported strange effects afterward. One staff member claimed she began hearing footsteps in her apartment late at night, slow and heavy, though she lived alone. Another swore she saw a pale shape reflected in her television screen when it was turned off. The reel is no longer on display. It was placed into secure storage after only 2 public showings. The museum never explained why. Some say the final frame, the one with the pale figure at the top of the stairwell, began to change. That the figure leaned closer every time someone looked. Let's move to our third story. The lighthouse at Hollows Point was a lonely structure, even by maritime standards, built in 1836 on a jagged finger of black rock. It stood far from town, accessible only by a narrow causeway at low tide. The people of the nearby village used it as little more than a reference on maps, a warning to sailors to steer clear of the reefs. But in the oral tradition of the town, Hollows Point carried a darker weight. Its reputation was not tide only, to storms or wreckage, but to the lingering laughter of a child who had been gone for more than a century. Her name was Anna Merrill. She was the only daughter of Thomas Merrill, a keeper assigned to Hollows Point in 1859. Records from the period show that Thomas was a widower, his wife having died of consumption 2 years earlier. He raised Anna alone in the lighthouse. The girl, known to locals as small and curious, often seen walking barefoot on the tidal flats collecting shells. At age 8, her short life ended in tragedy. The official account was simple. She drowned. One autumn evening in 1862, Anna failed to return from her tide pool wanderings. Thomas searched through the night by lantern, and in the morning, her body was found on the rocks below the lighthouse. The coroner listed accidental drowning as the cause of death, but almost immediately, stories began to spread. Fishermen claimed that in the fog, they heard a child's giggle drifting from the lighthouse, high and clear, as though carried by the wind. Others swore they saw a pale figure running along the lantern gallery at night, far too small to be Thomas. Even more unsettling were the handprints. Visitors reported finding tiny impressions on the inside of the lantern glass, pressed against it from within. Thomas himself never spoke of it. He served another decade at Hollows Point before resigning, retiring inland to live the remainder of his days in silence. The legend of Anna did not fade with him by the early 1900s. Hollows Point was considered cursed ground. Sailors avoided it, believing Anna's spirit lured ships to wreck on the rocks. Children dared each other to walk the causeway at dusk, to leave candy or toys at the base of the lighthouse in exchange for hearing her laugh. Some claimed they saw small wet footprints leading into the tower, though the door was locked tight. The most famous account came in 1923, when a pair of university folklorists, Dr. Clara Evans and Henry Booth, visited Hollows Point to document its ghost stories. Their journals, preserved in the university archives, describe their experiences in detail. On their second night at the lighthouse, Booth wrote, "At approximately 2 in the morning, while standing near the base of the tower, Dr. Evans and I both heard what can only be described as a child's laughter. It was not distant, not distorted by wind, but clear and close, as though someone stood a few feet away. We shone our lanterns, but no figure was visible. The sound repeated twice more, circling us, before vanishing." Dr. Evans added her own note the following day. "What unsettled me most were the prints. We found them upon the lantern glass when we ascended the tower to investigate, small, distinct, and placed at a height consistent with a child of 8 years. The glass was warm to the touch from the flame, yet the condensation was marked as though by cold fingers. Neither returned to Hollows Point after that trip. Booth died of pneumonia 3 years later, and Evans refused to ever speak of the lighthouse again by the mid-20th century. Anna's legend had become embedded in local culture. Parents invoked her name as a warning. Come inside before dark or Anna will follow you home. Teenagers used her story for dares, leaving trinkets on the rocks in hopes of hearing the giggle. Some swore that toys left overnight would be gone by morning, replaced by seaweed or shells. One fisherman, Robert N., gave a particularly chilling testimony in 1957. "We were pulling nets in thick fog when we heard it. A girl's laugh, plain as day, coming from the shore. My mate shouted, thought maybe some child had wandered out in the weather. But when we looked, I swear by my life we saw her standing on the rocks, white dress plastered to her like it was soaked through. She waved, just once. We cut the nets and rowed hard for the village. Never went back." The physicality of the reports grew more disturbing with time. By the 1970s, multiple visitors described feeling a child's hand slip into theirs while climbing the lighthouse stairs. Always cold, always wet. One woman claimed she nearly fell when she looked down and saw no child beside her. The last official keeper of Hollows Point, a man named Samuel Briggs, abandoned his post in 1981. In his resignation letter, preserved by the Coast Guard archives, he wrote, "I cannot stay here another night. The girl is real. I hear her every dusk, playing in the fog, running the stairs. She knocks on my door, though the handle never turns. I awake to prints on the glass, and once, God help me, I awoke to her face inches from mine, dripping with seawater, eyes black as the tide. You may call me mad, but I will not remain her keeper." Since then, Hollows Point has remained unstaffed. The light was automated, the tower locked. But the legend persists. Hikers who walk the causeway claim to hear laughter drifting in the mist. Locals still warn children not to stray too far along the shore. And once, in 2009, a tourist uploaded a blurry photograph said to show a child's face pressed against the lantern glass. It spread briefly online, before being dismissed as a hoax. Yet, in the village nearest Hollows Point, they do not call it a hoax. To them, Anna Merrill is as real as the tide. She is the keeper's daughter who never left, the girl who drowned but refused to sink. They say her spirit still lingers in the lighthouse, waiting for playmates, leaving her handprints on the glass as proof. And if you ever hear laughter in the fog near Hollows Point, the only thing you must not do is laugh back. Let's move to our fourth story. The lighthouse at Grey Rock Point had always been a stubborn fixture on the cliffs, its presence a testament to human engineering against nature's fury. But for the keepers who served there, it was far more than a functional beacon. It was a prison of stone and iron, a place where isolation could twist perception and, in some cases, invite something altogether unnatural. The story begins in the summer of 1899, when a young keeper named Edward Mallory was assigned to Grey Rock Point. He was 24, a diligent man with a precise sense of duty. The previous keeper had left unexpectedly, citing ill health, though rumors whispered of strange lights and voices in the fog. Edward dismissed such tales as the ramblings of old men terrified by the sea. His first few days were ordinary. He cleaned the tower, polished the brass of the lantern room, and inspected the massive Fresnel lens, marveling at the engineering. The lantern burned brightly, fueled by oil meticulously measured and maintained. Ships passing offshore were visible in the twilight, and Edward found satisfaction in knowing his light guided them safely through treacherous waters. It was on the fourth night that he noticed something odd. The lantern, which he had extinguished after a particularly long shift, remained faintly lit when he returned in the morning. At first he thought it an optical illusion caused by the sun's rising rays, but the glow persisted throughout the day. Curious, he opened the oil reservoir, empty. There was no fuel, and yet the flame burned steadily. Casting sharp shadows against the walls, Edward attempted to douse it with sand, with water, even by smothering it under the lantern cover. Nothing worked. The flame continued, unaffected by his attempts. By the third day, he began recording the anomaly in his journal. "The flame burns still," he wrote. "No oil, no wick intact. It does not flicker, nor does it dim. I cannot account for it." Word of the phenomenon spread slowly among the coastal towns. Sailors whispered that the lantern was cursed, that it was a beacon not for ships, but for something far older, something waiting beyond the cliffs. Edward, however, refused to indulge superstition. He was a man of logic, of science, and he resolved to document the lantern's strange persistence in meticulous detail. The weeks that followed were exhausting. Edward recorded every fluctuation in the tide, every gust of wind, every change in the light. Yet the lantern's flame never waned. His sleep grew fitful. The light, even during the day, seemed to pierce his eyelids when he rested. Shadows cast by the flame moved independently, stretching and twisting in ways that defied geometry. Then came the nights. Edward would hear footsteps, echoing across the spiral stairwell leading to the lantern room, though no one was there. At first he attributed them to the wind, or the settling of the stone tower. But the sounds were deliberate, measured, paced. Sometimes the steps would stop, just below the lantern, as though something was standing, waiting. When he approached, the stairwell was empty by mid-August. The keepers who visited briefly to deliver supplies began to notice it too. A visiting assistant, Thomas Gray, reported seeing a faint figure moving within the lantern glass during one stormy evening, though the tower was locked and Edward was alone. Another sailor claimed the light burned brighter than the sun itself, illuminating the cliffside in a stark, unnatural glare that lasted hours beyond dusk. Edward's journal entries reflect a slow descent into obsession. I cannot leave it unattended. It burns without fuel. It will not die. I dream of it at night, and the flame calls me to stand within its light, to feel the warmth, yet I fear what waits in the shadows it casts. Soon, other anomalies emerged. Ships navigating near Grey Rock Point began to report unusual incidents. Small vessels were found abandoned, rigging snapped, anchors cast aside. No crew was ever located, and weather logs reported calm seas during the disappearances. Word spread along the coast that the lighthouse was dangerous, a place to be avoided, and Edward found himself increasingly isolated. It was in September that the flame seemed to take on a consciousness of its own. Edward described in his journal how the shadows now moved of their own volition, forming shapes of men and women he did not recognize, all staring at him with hollow eyes. The light would flare when he looked away, as though commanding his attention. He could hear faint whispers carried by the wind, words and languages he did not understand. Yet he felt compelled to obey. He tried leaving, descending to the village, but found that no matter where he went, the glow followed him. At night, the flame was visible through the fog, burning in the distance where it should have been invisible. Edward returned repeatedly, drawn against his will. By all measures, the lantern had claimed him. His journal becomes fragmented in October. The entries are scarcely legible, hastily scrawled across margins, interrupted by large ink blots. He writes of the flame speaking, of visions beyond the cliffs, of the faces of lost sailors staring at him from within the glass. One entry reads simply, "It wants me to stand within it. I cannot resist." On October 18th, the lighthouse assistant delivering supplies found the tower door unlocked, Edward's lantern extinguished, and the tower empty. No trace of Edward was ever discovered, though the lantern continued to burn. Oil had long since run out, the wick was charred to the base, and yet the flame remained, steady and unyielding. Over the years, other keepers were assigned to Grey Rock Point, and each encountered similar phenomena. Some claimed to see the same shadows moving within the lantern. Some reported whispers that beckoned them to stand too close. Many resigned quickly. A few disappeared entirely. Ships still avoid the point when fog is heavy, and sailors speak of the eternal flame that burns without cause, warning of something that waits for the unwary. By the 1930s, the lighthouse became automated. Edward's journals, preserved in the local archives, were consulted by maritime historians, who noted the eerie consistency of the accounts. The lantern never dies, and those who study it too long are changed forever. Some claim the flame is conscious, a vessel for the spirits of lost keepers or sailors, feeding on isolation and fear. In interviews decades later, descendants of Edward Mallory recalled family stories of his obsession. Letters describe him as gaunt, haunted, speaking of things no one else could see. He never married, and in his final years, he refused to discuss Grey Rock Point entirely. The lantern remains. Modern sensors confirm the impossibility of its burn. Scientists attempting to explain the phenomenon have measured no energy source, no chemical reaction capable of sustaining it. The light continues, eternal, and the local population treats it with reverence and fear. Tourists are warned not to approach after dusk. Those who observe the tower report that, on quiet nights, the flame seems to flicker in acknowledgement. Some claim they can hear faint voices in the wind, chanting in unison. The lighthouse has been preserved as a historical site, yet the flame remains untouchable, undiminished, a beacon of dread. Some say the lantern does not only burn oilless, it burns souls. Each keeper assigned to Grey Rock Point is drawn inexorably toward the flame. Those who resist vanish. Those who submit remain, becoming part of the fire that never dies. Edward Mallory's final journal page, found sealed in a metal box near the lantern room, contains a single scrawled sentence: "I cannot leave. The flame calls, and I am its keeper forever." Even today, Visitors report the same phenomena. Shadows moving independently of any source. Whispers that echo without origin, and a light that refuses to die. Grey Rock Point stands on the cliffs, its eternal flame a warning that some fires, once lit, are beyond human control, and some keepers are never meant to leave. Let's move to our fifth story. The lighthouse at Ravencliff Point was infamous long before Edward Hargrove arrived to assume the keeper's post in 1937, built on a jagged outcrop overlooking a turbulent cove. The tower was tall, unpainted, and weathered by centuries of relentless storms. For generations, keepers were drawn to it by duty, but many left within weeks, citing isolation, madness, or unexplained phenomena. Edward, however, was determined. He had grown up near the sea, a man of steady nerves and careful habits. Nothing about the lighthouse could intimidate him more so, he thought. His first week passed without incident. He familiarized himself with the spiral stairs, the Fresnel lens, and the lighthouse logbooks, noting the previous keeper's meticulous records. The tower's rhythm, its daily rituals of oiling, polishing, and lighting the lantern, was comforting. He even found joy in the foghorn, which bellowed at regular intervals across the bay. Alone, he was productive, disciplined, and certain of his sanity. But the fog came unexpectedly. Thick, suffocating, and wet, it enveloped the cliffs and sea. For nearly 10 days straight. On the first night, Edward awoke to the sound of voices carried on the wind. They were faint, muffled, indistinct, like whispers from a distance. At first he dismissed them as sailors, calling to each other, or echoes from the waves hitting the rocks. Yet the more he listened, the more distinct they became. By the third night, Edward realized the voices were calling his name. Edward. The tone was not angry or threatening. It was insistent, coaxing, almost intimate. He stepped onto the lantern balcony, peering into the gray haze. The fog was thick enough that he could not see the ocean, nor the cliffs immediately below. There was nothing, no ships, no figures, only the oppressive whiteness that swallowed sound and light alike. Over the next week, the voices grew more coherent. They spoke in fragments, sometimes sentences. Sometimes they whispered warnings. Edward found himself responding, out loud, sometimes muttering questions to the fog. The strangeness did not alarm him at first. Rather, it became a strange companionship. The isolation, which had once been comfortable, now held a voice, a presence that was undeniably alive. He began recording the encounters in a journal. "The fog speaks tonight," he wrote on the 10th day. "It tells me things, tells me secrets of the cove, of the cliffs, of the sea. I am not afraid, I feel connected." But the connection grew obsessive. Edward spent hours on the balcony, straining to hear faint words that often contradicted each other. Sometimes the fog seemed to mimic human speech. At other times, it whispered in languages he did not recognize. He tried to step away, to read, to maintain the routines of lighthouse keeping, but the fog would not allow it. He began to neglect his duties, forgetting to polish the lens, missing scheduled log entries, and ignoring routine inspections of the lantern. The journal entries reveal the start of Edward's psychological unraveling. He wrote of shadows in the fog that moved deliberately, of shapes that appeared just at the edge of visibility. He described a feeling of being followed, not by a person, but by something formless, waiting patiently. By the end of the second week, he admitted, "I see them now. Faces in the fog. Some smiling, some weeping. They watch me. I speak. They answer. They know me." His sleep became fragmented. At night, he awoke to whispers around his bed, faint brushing against his skin, cold and damp. He began to see figures outside his window, always pale, always indistinct, vanishing if he looked directly. His reflection in the lantern glass sometimes showed another man standing behind him, though the room was empty. Visitors to the lighthouse, primarily supply workers, began to notice changes. Edward's demeanor had grown erratic. He would greet them warmly one moment, and then snap in fear, insisting the fog had warned him of intruders. On one visit, a supply assistant reported seeing Edward standing on the balcony, talking to the fog in what sounded like a conversation with someone invisible. When questioned, Edward said only, "They're here. They've always been here." and now they know I know. By the third week of isolation, Edward's behavior became dangerous. He barricaded parts of the tower, placing furniture in stairways, claiming the fog was attempting to enter. He neglected meals, sometimes eating only cold rations, or not at all. He began speaking constantly to the fog, carrying on elaborate conversations, arguing with it, pleading, begging. His journal, by now, was filled with incoherent notes. Some pages torn or scorched, as though to destroy evidence. The local authorities eventually received word of his behavior from a passing fisherman. When a small rescue party arrived, they found the lighthouse in near-complete disorder. Furniture was overturned, shelves stripped bare, the lantern oil untouched, and Edward, nowhere, only his journal remained, open on the floor near the balcony. With the final entry reading, "I walked into the fog today. They asked me to join them. I could not refuse. I hear the sea whisper my name, calling me back. I am leaving, finally, but I will not be alone." Edward Hargrove was never seen again. Despite extensive searches along the cliffs and shoreline, no trace was found. The lighthouse remained staffed intermittently, yet no keeper could endure more than a few days before, reporting similar auditory hallucinations, shadows, and whispers. The phenomenon, it seemed, was tied not to the fog itself, but to the human mind, susceptible to isolation and suggestion by the 1950s. The lighthouse at Ravencliff Point had gained a reputation as cursed. Sailors avoided it during foggy nights. Children dared one another to approach the cliffs only briefly, lest they hear voices calling them into the mist. Researchers visiting in later decades recorded consistent phenomena, sound anomalies, inexplicable chills, and a persistent sensation of being observed. Modern accounts suggest that the fog itself may not be merely meteorological. Witnesses report the same disembodied voices that Edward heard, claiming names, recounting past events, and sometimes predicting accidents before they occur. Tourists report hearing whispered instructions, faint laughter, or warnings to turn back, despite clear weather. Psychologists theorize that prolonged isolation, sound distortion and fog, and human suggestibility explain many of the experiences. Yet those who have endured even a few nights near Ravencliff Point report sensations that defy logic, shadows that move independently, whispers when no wind is present, and a compulsion to enter the fog, despite knowing its danger. Some claim Edward still walks within the fog, his mind fused with the phenomenon he encountered. Others suggest the fog collects keepers who linger too long, preserving their consciousness in some spectral limbo. The lighthouse remains operational, automated, but the balcony is always locked, and no one is permitted to stay overnight. Visitors, if patient, report a strange calm before nightfall, followed by the creeping sound of faint voices. The cliffs remain treacherous, and the cove below hides jagged rocks. And for those who pause and listen, the fog may call their name, just as it called Edward Hargrove, promising companionship, insight, or oblivion, and perhaps the same fate that claimed the keeper who spoke to the mist. Let's move to our sixth story. The Stonemire Lighthouse had long been a subject of speculation and rumor. Along the northern coast, built in 1872 atop craggy cliffs, the tower had a reputation far beyond its utility as a navigational aid. Reports of vanished keepers, strange lights, and inexplicable sounds had circulated for decades. It was said that the tides near the cliffs never rested, always whispering in rhythms that seemed almost human. Despite, or perhaps because of these stories, a small team of paranormal researchers arrived at one chilly October evening, determined to document the lighthouse's anomalies firsthand. The team consisted of 4 members: James Mercer, the lead investigator; Claire Donovan, a sound engineer and skeptic; Daniel Kwan, a camera operator; and Lena Alvarez, a historian specializing in maritime legends. Each brought their expertise, but none could have anticipated the nightmarish experiences awaiting them. Their initial inspection was routine. The lighthouse was in disrepair, with rusted iron railings, creaking stairways, and peeling paint. The Fresnel lens gleamed faintly under layers of grime, catching the moonlight. They set up cameras and recording devices, ensuring every angle of the tower was documented. The air was thick with salt and fog, a damp chill seeping into their clothes. At first, nothing unusual occurred. The team joked about the reputation of the lighthouse, attributing earlier disappearances to harsh weather, isolation, and human error. But as night fell, the environment itself seemed to change. The fog rolling in from the cliffs carried a strange resonance, almost like whispering. Claire, monitoring the audio feed, remarked on the subtle, rhythmic undulations in the soundscape, patterns that resembled distant voices. "It's probably just the wind," James said, though even he sounded uncertain. By midnight, the first anomaly became evident. Daniel, reviewing live footage, pointed out an indistinct figure near the base of the lighthouse. It appeared pale and semi-transparent, dissolving when approached. The team cautiously investigated, but the ground was empty. Footprints in the sand, absent Lena recalled the historical accounts of vanished keepers, noting similarities. They all mentioned seeing someone or something standing at the cliffs, just before disappearing. Hours passed, and the team documented multiple occurrences. Faint whispers echoed in their microphones. Objects subtly shifted positions when unobserved. Most unnerving was the tide itself. Waves lapping at the cliffs seemed to pulse unnaturally, almost synchronized with the whispers. As the night deepened, James decided to ascend the spiral staircase to the lantern room for closer observation. Claire and Daniel followed, while Lena remained below, cataloging notes and checking the audio feeds. Inside the lantern room, the air grew oppressively warm, despite the cool night outside. The Fresnel lens reflected faint, ghostly images of figures who weren't there. Shadows moved independently, sliding across the walls in ways inconsistent with the lantern's light. James felt a sudden chill, his skin prickling. He could hear a voice clearly for the first time, whispering his name, James. He turned, but no one stood behind him. The voice repeated, now urgent, "Do not leave." "Stay panicked," Daniel attempted to film the source, but the camera feed became distorted. The lens captured flickering images of pale figures leaning toward the observers, mouths open in silent screams. Claire's audio equipment amplified strange low-frequency hums that rattled their chests. Below, Lena noticed the tide behaving unnaturally. The waves did not crash in ordinary patterns but pulsed rhythmically, as if breathing. Tiny forms emerged momentarily from the foam, disappearing before she could identify them. A low moan rose from the water, blending with the whispers drifting from the lighthouse. The team's cohesion began to fray. Fear, exhaustion, and the oppressive atmosphere took a toll. Daniel's camera malfunctioned intermittently, capturing impossible angles and ghostly apparitions that defied physics. Claire, normally skeptical, admitted to hearing multiple voices speaking simultaneously in languages she could not recognize. Around 3 a.m., the first disappearance occurred. Daniel was recording near the edge of the balcony when the fog thickened. Suddenly, James and Claire called to him, but he did not respond. Within moments, he was gone. The only evidence of his presence was his camera, lying on the floor, still recording static and faint. Distorted whispers. The remaining team members, now terrified, attempted to regroup. Lena suggested descending the staircase, but the tower had become disorienting. The spiral steps seemed longer, the walls shifting subtly, creating impossible geometries. They felt watched, followed, but saw nothing tangible. Every shadow hinted at movement, every sound was amplified by their panic. As dawn approached, the lighthouse seemed to breathe. The Fresnel lens emitted a faint glow even without sunlight, highlighting the swirling fog outside. The tides pulsed, louder, almost like a heartbeat. Lena tried to document everything, but her notebook pages became smeared with moisture from the fog. The ink running like tears. James insisted they leave, but as they attempted to descend, he found the staircase did not behave as expected. Steps led them back toward the lantern room, instead of the exit. Panic surged. Claire screamed when a pale figure emerged from the fog outside the windows, mimicking their movements, lips moving without sound. By mid-morning, Lena was alone. James and Claire had vanished, leaving behind only scattered equipment and faint, unidentifiable marks on the stone floor. The tide pulsed louder, reaching a crescendo that seemed almost alive. Lena wrote in her final notes, "The lighthouse is alive. It feeds on fear and observation. The fog knows us. I cannot leave. I hear the voices calling my name. If someone reads this, do not enter. The tides never sleep, and they never forget." Lena disappeared shortly after, leaving only her voice. Recordings, which captured distorted whispers, faint footsteps, and the relentless pulsing of the tide. Researchers analyzing the footage years later found no logical explanation. Audio anomalies were consistent with human speech, but not identifiable as any known language. Visual recordings captured impossible geometries and figures that defied the laws of physics. Stonemaier Lighthouse remains abandoned, but operational. Modern maritime operations maintain the light, but automated systems report strange fluctuations during foggy nights. Fishermen avoid the cove, citing unnatural tides and inexplicable sounds. Paranormal enthusiasts occasionally investigate, but few return, and those who do report lingering feelings of dread, auditory hallucinations, and the unnerving sensation of being observed. The legend of Stonemaier continues to grow. Whispers in the village speak of a lighthouse that watches, tides that remember, and fog that speaks. The disappeared investigators are memorialized in hushed tones, their recordings preserved as both warning and evidence. And every night, the lighthouse light shines, pulsing in rhythm with the tides, as if calling to those who dare approach, promising secrets, madness, or a permanent place among the whispers. Let's move to our 7th story. The lighthouse at Dreadshore Point was said to be older than memory. A massive structure of weathered stone and blackened brick, leaning precariously over cliffs that fell sharply into a roiling sea. Its reputation was steeped in local folklore. Villagers told stories of hollow men, keepers who had vanished without a trace, leaving only whispers and shadows behind. For decades, no one dared take the post, until a man named Simon Holloway arrived, drawn by work and necessity, rather than curiosity or bravado. Simon was young, in his late 20s, with a wiry frame and a steady hand. He had been a sailor in his youth, accustomed to storms and isolation, and believed the old tales were exaggerations meant to scare children. When he first stepped inside the lighthouse, the air smelled of salt, mildew, and something more elusive, a metallic temps that made the hair on his arms stand. The spiral staircase groaned underfoot as he ascended, and the lantern room at the top appeared massive. The Fresnel lens dark but impressively intact. For the first week, Simon's routine was simple and methodical. He cleaned the lens, recorded observations in the logbook, and maintained the oil reservoir. But the lighthouse seemed to have a rhythm of its own. At night, he noticed faint knocking from within the walls, low and deliberate. He told himself it was merely the stone settling, or perhaps rats scuttling behind the paneling. It began subtly. On the second night, while polishing the lens, Simon noticed his own reflection behaving oddly. It lagged behind his movements, twitching in ways he did not. At first, he laughed nervously, attributing it to fatigue and poor lighting. Yet the sensation persisted, growing more pronounced with each passing day. His reflection would sometimes smile when he was not smiling, frown when he was laughing. Simon also noticed whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible beneath the roar of the sea and the wind through the broken windows. He could not discern words, only tones, coaxing, angry, and sometimes urgent. By the end of the first week, the whispers became voices, repeating phrases in the night. Come to us, follow, be hollow. He attempted to ignore them, convincing himself it was exhaustion, the monotony of isolation gnawing at his mind. But the whispers became persistent, seeming to emanate from within the walls themselves. One night, Simon was awoken by a soft rhythmic tapping. He traced it to the lantern room walls. Brushing aside a panel, he found nothing but darkness and stone. Yet the sound continued, echoing behind his ears, even when he pulled away. It was during the second week that Simon first saw them, figures emerging from the stonework itself. They were pale, faceless, hollowed-out shapes that moved silently, leaning as if pressing through the walls from some other dimension. They did not speak, did not blink, but seemed to study him with an intensity that froze his blood. He tried to flee, But each time he moved toward the stairs, the tower stretched unnaturally. The steps elongated, twisting back on themselves, disorienting him until he returned to the lantern room, trapped. Simon's journal entries reveal a slow descent into terror. They are in the walls. I can see them if I stare too long. They do not breathe, yet I feel them around me. Their eyes are nothing, and yet they know me. By the third week, Simon's isolation had become unbearable. Sleep became impossible. He would sit for hours, staring into the walls, listening to the hollow voices echoing in unison. Join us, be hollow, follow. At times, he heard his own voice answering them. He could not remember speaking aloud, but the words would echo in the chamber. I will come. Food and water became secondary. The wind and sea outside seemed to obey the lighthouse itself. Gusts battering the walls at night, in perfect rhythm, with the hollow voices. Simon's mind fractured further when he saw the shadows of previous keepers in the walls. Faces pressed briefly against the stone, mouths moving silently, arms extended in eternal pleas. Desperation led Simon to explore every corner of the lighthouse, searching for secret chambers or hidden passages. Behind a crumbling panel in the stairwell, he found a narrow cavity, not wide enough for a human, but just enough for something smaller. Inside, faint scratches marked the stone, nearly indistinguishable from the texture of the wall. The whispers intensified as he approached, urging him closer. He could hear words clearly now. Hollow, become hollow. We await you. Simon fled back to the lantern room, but the figures followed. They moved through the walls, pressing toward him, their hollow eyes absorbing his light, their presence suffocating. His reflection no longer resembled him at all. It had become one of them, pale, faceless, hollow. He recoiled, but the reflection reached out, as if through some barrier, and touched him. The moment contact occurred, Simon felt a chill pass through his entire body, as if his very essence had been hollowed from within. He screamed. Yet the sound seemed trapped, absorbed into the stone walls themselves. The figures surrounded him, moving closer, pressing inward from the walls, ceiling, and floor. He tried to run, but the spiral staircase now twisted impossibly, leading back to the lantern room no matter which way he turned. Exhaustion and terror took hold. Simon collapsed onto the cold stone floor, clutching his head as the whispers became a deafening chorus. His final journal entries are fragmented, scrawled across torn pages, ink smeared with moisture. They are inside me. The walls, the hollow, cannot leave. Become. When villagers came weeks later, responding to a sudden lapse in the lighthouse's light, they found the tower empty. Simon Halloway had vanished entirely. The lantern burned dimly, the Fresnel lens intact, yet the light flickered unnaturally. The spiral staircase was intact, but the interior walls now bore strange impressions. Faint scratches forming patterns, suggesting movement beneath the stone. Over the years, other keepers assigned to Dreadshore Point reported similar phenomena. They described whispers, shadows pressing from the walls, reflections behaving independently, and an overpowering compulsion to approach the stone cavities. Some lasted days, others weeks, but all eventually succumbed to the hollow presence within. Those who returned to the village were gaunt, pale, and silent, refusing to speak of the lighthouse except in terrified whispers. The folklore of Dreadshore Point grew. Villagers told stories to children of the Hollow Keeper, a man claimed by the lighthouse, his essence absorbed into the walls, joining a chorus of lost keepers. The lighthouse remains operational today, but the interior is monitored remotely, and no one is allowed to stay overnight. Visitors occasionally report faint scratching sounds, fleeting shadows behind the walls, and the unsettling sensation that someone, or something, is pressing from within the stone. The lighthouse endures, a monument, not only to maritime navigation but to an ancient, malevolent presence that claims the minds and souls of those who linger too long. And on nights when the wind is high and the waves crash relentlessly, some swear they can hear the hollow voices whispering through the stone, calling for new keepers to join them, promising the same fate that claimed Simon Halloway, a slow, inevitable absorption into the walls, until only a hollow echo of humanity remains. Let's move to our 8th story. The lighthouse at Blackwater Point had always been an unwelcoming sentinel against the sea. Towering above jagged cliffs, battered by salt-laden winds and ceaseless storms, it was said that anyone who served as its keeper rarely remained sane for long. Legends spoke of a cursed lantern, hidden deep within the tower, left behind by a previous keeper who vanished mysteriously nearly a century ago. When Marcus Layton arrived to assume the post in 1942, he was unaware of the lantern's dark history. Marcus was a meticulous man, a retired naval officer, accustomed to long stretches of isolation. His first days at the lighthouse were uneventful, filled with inspections, cleaning, and routine maintenance. The tower's structure was old but remarkably resilient. Its spiral staircase echoed with every footstep, and the lantern room at the top offered a panoramic view of the roaring ocean below. Despite the harsh winds and constant fog, Marcus felt confident in his abilities and unshaken by local superstitions. It was during the second week that he first discovered the lantern. Hidden behind a false panel in the lantern room, it appeared. Ordinary at first glance, a brass frame, a glass encasement, and an intricately carved base depicting faces frozen in agony. Its wick was old and blackened, and the flame, of course, was unlit. Yet, when Marcus cleaned the glass and polished the brass, he felt a peculiar warmth emanating from it, as though the lantern itself were aware of his presence. The first night he left the lantern near the window, he dreamt vividly. In his sleep, he saw pale faces pressed against the glass, eyes hollow, mouths mouthing silent pleas. When he awoke, the lantern glimmered faintly, despite no light source. He dismissed it as a trick of his imagination, fueled by the isolation and exhaustion. By the third week, Marcus began to hear whispers, soft and almost imperceptible, emanating from the lantern whenever he entered the room. At first the whispers were indistinct, forming broken phrases that promised knowledge, power, or insight. Look deeper. Remember, they await. The voices seemed to murmur. Marcus, rational and disciplined, tried to ignore them, focusing, instead, on routine tasks. But the more he resisted, the louder and more persistent the whispers became. He began to notice subtle changes in his environment. Shadows seemed to linger longer than physics should allow. The reflections in the lanterns glass sometimes showed more than his own image, fleeting figures standing just behind him, pale and indistinct. When he turned, the figures vanished, leaving only the cold, empty room. Marcus's journal entries reveal a gradual descent into obsession. The lantern, it knows me. I feel it watching when I am elsewhere. The whispers, I hear them even in sleep. I cannot leave it. I cannot resist. As the days passed, Marcus began experimenting with the lantern. Lighting it revealed no flame beyond what he expected, but the warmth and faint glow persisted, as though fueled by an unseen source. The faces on the base seemed to shift slightly, twisting in agony or silently screaming, leaving Marcus unnerved yet compelled to continue his studies. The whispers grew coherent, forming full sentences and addressing Marcus by name. Marcus, join us. Your soul belongs. The tone was both seductive and threatening, promising power and understanding in exchange for obedience. Marcus began responding, talking to the lantern for hours, confiding secrets, fears, and regrets. It was no longer a lifeless object. It had become a confidant, a presence, almost sentient. Isolation compounded the effect. Marcus began to neglect his duties, failing to polish the lens, forgetful of oiling the wick, skipping entries in the official log. He spent hours in the lantern room, tracing the carvings, studying the glass, and speaking aloud to the unseen entities that seemed bound to the object. Sleep became fragmented, dreams increasingly vivid and terrifying. In these dreams, the lantern burned brightly, illuminating faces pressed against the walls of the tower, their mouths silent but eyes screaming. By the fifth week, Marcus's behavior had grown erratic. Villagers in the nearby town reported strange lights flickering from the lighthouse at odd hours, accompanied by low, almost musical whispers carried on the wind. A passing supply boat noticed the lantern's glow, even in daylight, an impossible phenomenon that caused the crew to quickly leave the area. Marcus's journal entries grew increasingly fragmented, obsessive, and disturbing. I have lit it. I have lit it. They are here now, surrounding me. The walls breathe, the faces. They are mine, and I am theirs. Do not touch it. Do not. Attempts to leave the lantern room became futile. The lighthouse seemed to shift subtly. The staircase. Twisting doors leading back to the lantern room regardless of direction. Marcus began to experience hallucinations. His reflection in the glass, behaving independently. Whispering commands. His own voice echoing back with subtle distortions. The lantern's presence became overwhelming. Marcus could feel the weight of countless souls pressing from the base, faces writhing silently. When he touched it, he felt as if icy hands gripped his mind, pulling thoughts and memories away. Sleep deprivation and mental strain rendered him increasingly vulnerable. The culmination occurred one stormy night. The wind howled, rain lashed against the windows, and the sea below churned violently. Marcus, entranced by the lantern, placed it at the center of the room and lit it. The light burned unnaturally bright, illuminating the faces on the base as though they were alive. The whispers became voices, speaking in unison, demanding surrender. Marcus's consciousness wavered. He felt his identity dissolve into the lantern, a tether between his soul and the object. Morning came, and the supply boat arrived as scheduled. The crew found the lighthouse eerily silent. The lantern burned steadily, its glow unnatural, even in daylight. Marcus Layton was nowhere to be found. His journal lay open near the base of the lantern. Pages smeared with condensation and scrawled with fragmented words. I am theirs. I am the lantern. They remember me. They are forever. Subsequent keepers reported similar phenomena, whispers emanating from the lantern, hallucinations of faces in the walls, and an irresistible compulsion to spend hours speaking to the object. Some fled after days, others vanished entirely. The lighthouse remained functional only through remote automation in later decades, with the cursed lantern sealed behind reinforced glass, yet still glowing faintly. Researchers and historians examining the site described the object as a conduit for trapped souls, its influence exacerbated by isolation. Attempts to remove or destroy the lantern have failed. It is impervious to fire, water, and physical force. Psychologists attribute its effects to extreme sensory deprivation and suggestion. But even skeptics report unease when near the lantern, a sense of being watched, whispered commands, and the subtle shifting of shadows that defy logic to this day. Blackwater Point Lighthouse continues to cast its glow over the cliffs and sea. The lantern within burns faintly, a warning and a lure. Whispers carry across the wind, audible only to those who listen, promising power, knowledge, or oblivion. And anyone who enters the lantern room, even briefly, risks succumbing to the same fate as Marcus Layton, a complete erasure of self, becoming part of the object, lost among the forgotten souls bound within. Let's move to our ninth story. The Hartwell Lighthouse had been abandoned for decades. Standing like a skeletal sentinel against the storm-lashed cliffs of Greyhaven Bay, its rusted iron balcony and crumbling stone walls gave the tower a menacing silhouette, perpetually shrouded in fog and mist. Rumors about the lighthouse's dark history had circulated among fishermen and townsfolk for generations, banishing's unexplainable lights and whispers carried by the wind. When Daniel Rivers, an ambitious videographer specializing in paranormal investigations, arrived to document the lighthouse, he believed he was prepared for anything. Daniel's plan was straightforward. Spend a week alone in the lighthouse with cameras and audio equipment, capturing any supernatural phenomena. He brought with him a high-definition camera, night vision equipment, and multiple audio recorders. The first day was uneventful, with the tower creaking under the wind and distant waves crashing against the cliffs below. The spiraling staircase groaned with every step, and the lighthouse's lens, though dark and unused for years, still caught the sunlight in a spectral glow. As night fell on the second day, the atmosphere changed. Daniel set up cameras in the lantern room and along the stairwell. He began recording, narrating his observations in a calm, measured tone. But a faint hum began to infiltrate the audio feed, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to resonate through the stone walls themselves. At first, he assumed it was wind interacting with the tower's ironwork. Yet the hum had a cadence, a rhythm almost like a heartbeat. By the third night, Daniel noticed anomalies. Small objects in the room, a lantern, a journal, a cup, had shifted from their original positions, despite no one else being present. Shadows appeared to move independently, stretching along the walls, even when the overhead lights were off. His cameras occasionally captured fleeting figures in the corners of the lens, pale and distorted, vanishing when approached. The first recordings of these figures made Daniel uneasy, but he dismissed them as technical glitches. On the fourth night, Daniel began hearing whispers. They were faint at first, just beyond comprehension, but gradually became intelligible. The voices called his name, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding. "Daniel, look deeper. Don't leave. Stay with us." The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing in the stone walls, the stairwell, and the lantern room. Daniel tried to rationalize it, attributing the whispers to auditory hallucinations or the wind. But the persistence of the phenomenon wore him down. Desperate for evidence, Daniel moved deeper into the lighthouse. He found a hidden chamber behind a crumbling panel in the stairwell. The room was small, barely large enough for one person, and contained remnants of previous keepers, journals, rusted tools, and faintly decayed clothing. The air was thick with dust and the unmistakable scent of decay. The walls bore strange symbols, carved and worn with age. Daniel recorded everything, narrating in a hushed, tense tone. His voice betraying fear he refused to admit aloud. As he explored the hidden chamber, the whispers intensified. They began speaking of events in the past, detailing the disappearances of keepers, describing their final moments with eerie precision. Daniel realized the voices were recounting events that had never been documented publicly. Names, dates, and incidents that could not have been known to him were revealed with unnerving accuracy. The lighthouse seemed to change with each passing hour. Hallways appeared longer, rooms rearranged themselves, and doors led back to places already visited. Daniel became increasingly disoriented. He noted in his journal that time seemed to move irregularly, hours passing in minutes, minutes stretching to hours. Exhaustion, confusion, and terror began to erode his mental state. On the fifth night, Daniel recorded the first direct encounter. A pale, faceless figure appeared in the lantern room, standing silently behind the camera. Daniel's initial reaction was disbelief. When he moved to approach, the figure vanished, leaving behind only an unnatural chill and a faint imprint on the floor. His equipment began malfunctioning, static bursts on video, audio feed distorted, night vision cameras flickering as if the figure interfered with them. By the sixth night, Daniel's isolation had become unbearable. He began conversing aloud with the figures, sometimes pleading, sometimes arguing. The whispering voices promised knowledge, understanding, and safety if he would submit. At other times, they threatened harm, repeating variations of a single, chilling message: "You cannot leave. We are the lighthouse. You belong." Daniel's recordings from this night show a complete deterioration of his composure. His narrations shift from professional tone to frantic, disjointed ramblings. He mentions seeing previous keepers in visions, observing them being absorbed into the walls, their faces frozen in silent screams. Shadows moved across the room like liquid, forming shapes that defied logic. The low-frequency hum became louder, pulsating with the rhythm of Daniel's heartbeat. By the seventh night, the haunting reached its peak. The hidden chamber seemed to expand impossibly, enclosing him. The walls bled shadows, the symbols etched into the stone glowing faintly as the figures materialized around him. Daniel's camera recorded the full horror, pale, faceless entities pressing through the walls, whispering his name, moving in unnatural ways. Some partially transparent, others entirely corporeal. Daniel attempted to flee but became lost within the lighthouse. Hallways twisted upon themselves. Staircases spiraled endlessly, and doors led only to more darkness. In the final hours, Daniel left a desperate log on his camera. He spoke rapidly, voice quivering, describing the entities, the impossible architecture, and the overwhelming compulsion to submit. "They are inside me, the walls. I can hear them. I cannot leave. God help me." The camera feed became unstable visual distortions obscuring his movements. Shadows engulfed him, and the recording captured only faint whispers and the persistent hum of the lighthouse itself. When a search party arrived weeks later, the Hartwell Lighthouse stood silent. Daniel Rivers was never found. His equipment remained, cameras running, still recording static and faint audio whispers. Analysts reviewing the footage noted impossible geometries, spectral figures, and voices speaking in languages unrecognizable, yet structured as if conveying precise meaning. The lighthouse remained operational for navigation purposes, but was declared uninhabitable due to its anomalous properties. Local fishermen and villagers continued to report strange lights and whispers near the lighthouse. No one dared stay overnight. Paranormal enthusiasts occasionally attempted to investigate, only to return shaken. Reporting, disorientation, auditory hallucinations, and the persistent sensation of being watched. Hartwell Lighthouse retained its reputation as a place where time and space no longer adhered to ordinary rules, and where those who enter risk vanishing completely, leaving only whispers, recordings, and an impossible silence behind. Even today, the surviving footage from Daniel Rivers serves as both a warning and a source of fascination. Researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators have studied it extensively. Yet no rational explanation exists for the events he captured. Hartwell Lighthouse remains a sentinel of fear, a place where the boundary between the living and the spectral is perilously thin, and where those who enter may find themselves trapped forever, becoming part of the lighthouse's eternal, unending story. Let's move to our 10th story. The lighthouse at Grimwater Point had long been abandoned, a sentinel of stone standing defiantly against the crashing waves and relentless winds of the northern coast. Its dark brickwork, streaked with salt and lichen, was a testament to decades of storms and neglect. Local legends spoke of strange disappearances, phantom lights, and echoes of voices carried across the cliffs at night. When Henry Caldwell, a former Coast Guard officer with a meticulous mind and an interest in the paranormal, arrived to serve as the temporary keeper, he believed the stories were nothing more than superstition. The first week passed uneventfully. Henry meticulously cleaned the lantern, recorded observations in his log, and explored the tower from top to bottom. The spiral staircase groaned underfoot, the walls emanating a cold dampness, and the lantern room offered a panoramic view of the endless, gray sea. The isolation was palpable, yet Henry felt invigorated by the solitude, convinced that the lighthouse's eerie reputation was merely folklore. It was on the second week that he first noticed the echoes. At first they were subtle, faint sounds of footsteps, whispers, and the occasional metallic clang, seemingly carried by the stone walls themselves. Henry rationalized these disturbances as the effects of the wind and the lighthouse's age. Yet the echoes grew more distinct each night, forming patterns that suggested deliberate repetition. Sometimes, the sounds seemed to mimic his own movements, trailing him up and down the spiral staircase with perfect timing. By the third week, Henry's sense of reality began to fray. The echoes became voices, whispering his name, recounting fragments of conversations he had never had. Henry, remember, follow. They seemed to intone. Shadows appeared to move independently, flickering in the corners of his vision, always vanishing when he turned to face them. Sleep became elusive. Dreams intruded upon his waking life, vivid and haunting, depicting figures in the lantern room watching silently as he polished the lens. Henry's journal entries grew obsessive. The echoes, they are learning me. I hear them when I am awake, when I am alone, when I try to sleep. They know my routines, my thoughts, my fears. Determined to understand, he began documenting every unusual phenomenon. He marked the time and location of each echo, attempted to replicate sounds, and even spoke aloud to the voices in an effort to communicate. In response, the echoes began to shift, forming phrases and sentences that described events he had no memory of experiencing. Names, places, and dates appeared in his mind, as if whispered directly into his thoughts. As isolation deepened, Henry's behavior became erratic. He would spend hours pacing the spiral staircase, listening intently to the walls. The lantern room seemed to expand subtly when he entered, its proportions stretching beyond comprehension. Reflections in the lantern glass occasionally revealed shadowy figures standing behind him, their faces indistinct, yet their presence undeniable. He began to feel watched, even in the absence of any visible entity. By the 4th week, Henry experienced full hallucinations. Figures from the lighthouse's past, keepers long gone, their faces frozen in terror, appeared and vanished in an instant. He began conversing with them aloud, demanding answers, receiving only cryptic replies. The echoes now took on a malevolent tone, sometimes issuing commands, other times delivering threats. You cannot leave. You are ours. Stay forever. Desperation led Henry to explore parts of the lighthouse he had previously avoided. Behind a rusted panel in the lantern room, he discovered a small, hidden chamber filled with relics of previous keepers, journals, rusted tools, and scraps of clothing. The walls bore strange carvings, some resembling human faces, others indecipherable symbols. The air inside was thick with dust and decay, and an oppressive sense of dread hung over the room. Henry documented everything, noting that the echoes seemed strongest within this chamber. The 5th week brought a crescendo of terror. The lighthouse's architecture appeared to shift subtly, staircases twisting back upon themselves, doors leading to rooms he had not entered before, and windows showing impossible angles of the cliffs outside. Shadows moved, in defiance of light, forming humanoid shapes that seemed to mimic Henry's actions. He could no longer trust his senses. Reflections, sounds, and even the sensation of touch betrayed him. Sleep deprivation, fear, and isolation culminated in a series of vivid hallucinations. Henry saw previous keepers trapped within the stone walls, their mouths opening to scream. Silently, eyes wide with terror. The echoes became indistinguishable from reality, and he found himself responding to the voices, speaking aloud to entities that may or may not exist. I will stay. I will follow. I belong. His journal entries became nearly illegible, scrawled with frantic repetition of names, dates, and cryptic warnings. On the 6th night, Henry's perception of time fractured completely. Hours seemed to stretch into days. Moments passed in the blink of an eye. The echoes now formed a chorus, a cacophony of voices and footsteps that filled every corner of the lighthouse. The lantern room itself seemed alive, glowing faintly without power, pulsating in rhythm with the echoes. Henry felt his mind unravel, identity slipping away, merging with the lighthouse's ancient presence. By the 7th week, Henry had vanished. When a scheduled inspection team arrived, the lighthouse was silent. His journals remained, scattered across the lantern room floor, filled with incoherent entries, warnings, and desperate pleas. The staircase led only to the same rooms. Windows showed impossible perspectives, and faint echoes of Henry's voice could still be heard, repeating fragments of his last entries. Subsequent attempts to occupy Grimwater Point Lighthouse ended. Similarly, keepers assigned temporarily reported hearing footsteps when alone, seeing shadows flicker in peripheral vision, and feeling watched incessantly. Some fled after days, others disappeared entirely. The lighthouse remains operational only through automated systems, and no one is permitted to stay overnight. Local folklore now refers to the lighthouse as a place where time and space are distorted, and where echoes of past keepers linger indefinitely. Visitors report sudden drops in temperature, faint whispers, and the sensation of unseen eyes observing every movement. The psychological effects are profound. Even skeptics admit a sense of disorientation and unease when near the tower. Grimwater Point Lighthouse stands today as a monument to human vulnerability, isolation, and the incomprehensible forces that may dwell within ancient stone. Those who enter risk losing not only their sanity, but also their very sense of self, consumed by echoes that remember, observe, and never forget. Let's move to our 11th story. The lighthouse at Blackmarsh Point had always held a sinister reputation among the villagers. Perched atop craggy cliffs, its stone walls were weathered by centuries of salt and storms, and the surrounding sea roared with an unrelenting fury. Local fishermen whispered of keepers who vanished without trace, strange lights flickering atop the tower at night, and voices that drifted across the fog like mournful warnings. Thomas Mercer, a seasoned mariner and new lighthouse keeper, arrived, One gray morning, eager for isolation and the sense of duty that came with keeping the light burning for passing ships, Thomas's first days were quiet. Almost too quiet. He inspected the lantern, cleaned the spiral staircase, and familiarized himself with the old tower. The lighthouse had been abandoned for decades before he took up residence, leaving behind a dust-covered interior filled with relics of past keepers. Among these relics, he discovered a small, intricately carved compass tucked into a hidden compartment beneath the lantern platform. Its brass casing was tarnished, but the needle gleamed with an unnatural intensity. The compass seemed ordinary at first glance, but Thomas felt an odd tug when he held it, as if it were alive. The first night, Thomas noticed that the compass needle spun wildly, even in the absence of wind or movement. He chalked it up to age and poor calibration. Yet as he climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room, the needle began to point toward various corners of the lighthouse, sometimes swinging erratically, sometimes hovering in one direction with deliberate intent. He dismissed the sensations as fatigue or imagination, a product of the lighthouse's isolation. On the third night, Thomas began to hear whispers, faint and almost imperceptible, emanating from the compass itself. Follow the path. Know the truth. The sound was subtle at first, just enough to make him glance over his shoulder. The whispers grew increasingly insistent, compelling him to explore areas of the lighthouse he had previously ignored. Dusty storage rooms, forgotten chambers, and hidden crawl spaces revealed items belonging to past keepers, journals, keys, and fragments of clothing. Each object seemed to carry the weight of its owner's fear and despair, pressing on Thomas in an unrelenting wave of unease. By the fifth night, Thomas's behavior began to change. The compass seemed to exert a strange influence, directing him to specific locations at precise times. When he followed its guidance, he discovered carvings on the walls depicting twisted faces, ships sinking in storm-tossed seas, and figures pleading in silent agony. Occasionally, he glimpsed shadows moving in the corners of his vision, vanishing when confronted directly. His journal entries became increasingly erratic. The compass, it shows me things I should not see. The keepers, they are watching. I cannot ignore it. The compass did not simply point, it seemed to lead. It drew him toward the lantern room's hidden compartments, into the spiral staircase's deepest recesses, and even two windows that offered views of impossible scenes, ships aflame on calm waters, sailors screaming silently as phantom hands reached for them. Thomas's nights were plagued by vivid hallucinations, spectral keepers replaying their last moments, drowning or fleeing in terror, all while the compass needle quivered and pulsed, as if reacting to unseen energies. Isolation exacerbated the phenomenon. The lighthouse seemed to transform around him. Hallways stretched impossibly long, staircases looped back on themselves, and the walls occasionally appeared translucent, revealing flickering, ghostly forms trapped within the stone. Thomas began conversing with these apparitions, asking questions that received no rational answer. The compass vibrated subtly in his hand whenever he approached one of these figures, pointing insistently, as if urging him closer. By the seventh night, Thomas's mental state had deteriorated. The whispers became coherent voices, urging him to complete a ritual that had long been forgotten, describing actions he did not fully understand. The compass guided him to the top of the lantern room during a raging storm, lightning illuminating the carved faces on the walls. He hesitated, aware that something was watching, something ancient and malevolent. Yet the compass continued to pulse in his palm, irresistible in its pull. Suddenly, the storm outside intensified. The wind screamed through the tower, the waves below churned violently, and the compass spun wildly. Thomas's vision blurred. Spectral figures of previous keepers appeared, some gesturing, some warning him, some silently pleading. The compass glow intensified, casting an eerie light across the lantern room, and Thomas felt an overwhelming force tugging at his mind. The whispers merged into a singular voice. Complete it. Join us, forever. In a moment of sheer terror, Thomas dropped the compass. It landed on the stone floor, spinning to a halt, with its needle pointing directly at him. The shadows surged forward, enveloping the room. Thomas felt his body lose control, as if he were no longer the master of his own movements. His screams echoed through the lighthouse, but the storm outside swallowed them instantly. When he awoke perhaps days later, he was alone, but the compass lay beside him, glowing faintly. The carved faces on the walls seemed subtly altered, their expressions twisted in new anguish. Subsequent visitors to the lighthouse reported the compass moving on its own, pointing to locations within the tower rather than magnetic north. Some claimed to hear whispers when nearby, recounting tragedies from decades past. The lighthouse itself became a focal point for strange occurrences, shadows stretching unnaturally, lights flickering at impossible times, and an oppressive feeling of being observed. Thomas Mercer was never seen again, though his journal remained, filled with frantic, partially coherent entries, describing his interactions with the cursed compass and the malevolent presence that seemed to inhabit the lighthouse today. The Blackmarsh Point Lighthouse remains operational, but the compass is sealed within a locked display in the lantern room, carefully monitored and never removed. Paranormal investigators occasionally visit, some documenting strange events, others fleeing after brief exposure to the compass's influence. Locals continue to warn outsiders to respect the lighthouse, emphasizing that those who tamper with the cursed compass risk vanishing, becoming part of the lighthouse's dark legacy, trapped forever among the echoes of the keepers who came before. The story of Thomas Mercer serves as both a warning and a fascination for those drawn to the lighthouse. His obsession with the compass, his descent into terror, and his ultimate disappearance underscore a chilling truth. Some objects are not meant to be understood, and some places harbor darkness that no human mind can endure without consequence. The Blackmarsh Point Lighthouse, with its cursed compass, remains a monument to human curiosity and the peril of uncovering forces beyond comprehension. Let's move to our 12th story. The lighthouse at Ravencliff Point had always loomed over the jagged northern cliffs like a silent sentinel. Its stone walls, blackened by centuries of storms and salt spray, seemed almost alive, whispering secrets to those who dared to listen. Locals spoke of a lineage of keepers cursed by misfortune and madness, their fates intertwined with the lighthouse in ways no outsider could comprehend. When Jonathan Hale inherited the post from a distant relative, he believed the stories were nothing more than superstition. A man of reason, Jonathan saw the inheritance as a responsibility and a unique opportunity for isolation. Far from the bustle of the mainland, his first days in the lighthouse were mundane. He inspected the lantern, cleaned the spiral staircase, and explored the darkened hallways. Among the belongings left behind by his ancestors, he discovered letters and journals that hinted at strange occurrences. But the cryptic language made it difficult to discern fact from fiction. The tower was silent, save for the constant wind and the rhythmic crashing of waves below. Yet, even in that solitude, Jonathan felt an uneasy presence, a subtle weight pressing against his mind, as if the lighthouse itself were aware of him. On the third night, Jonathan noticed the first anomalies. Shadows seemed to shift in unnatural ways, lingering at the edge of his vision before retreating when he looked directly. The sound of whispers floated on the wind, faint and almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably human in tone. The journals he had found described similar phenomena, attributing them to a watchful spirit tied to the lighthouse. Jonathan, though rational, could not ignore the sense of being observed, as if unseen eyes followed his every move. By the fifth night, Jonathan discovered a hidden chamber behind a decayed panel near the lantern room. Inside, he found a small wooden chest filled with artifacts belonging to previous keepers, worn keys, brass compasses, and carved figurines. Among them was a small mirror framed in blackened silver, etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The moment Jonathan looked into the mirror, he felt a chill run through his body, and the reflection staring back at him seemed subtly wrong, a twisted version of himself, with eyes darker and hollow, mouth slightly distorted. The whispers grew louder with each passing night, forming coherent words and sentences that only Jonathan could hear. "You belong, the tower remembers. Follow its guidance." At first he resisted, focusing on routine maintenance, keeping journals, and performing the daily chores of a keeper. Yet the presence became inescapable. The mirror, the artifacts, the shadows, all seemed to call to him, drawing him closer to secrets buried deep within the lighthouse's stone walls. Isolation intensified his psychological strain. Time became fluid, days bled into nights, and Jonathan often awoke from vivid dreams to find hours had passed in mere moments. The whispers began recounting events from his own life. Secrets he had never shared aloud, mistakes and regrets magnified as though the lighthouse knew him intimately. He started conversing with the shadows, asking questions, receiving no direct answers but sensing that the tower responded in subtle ways. Objects shifted slightly. Symbols glowed faintly, and the mirror's reflection pulsed in rhythm with the whispers. By the seventh night, Jonathan's sense of reality fractured. He saw spectral versions of his ancestors moving through the hallways, some watching silently, others gesturing urgently. The mirror now showed not just his reflection, but entire rooms filled with figures frozen in eternal torment. The artifacts in the hidden chamber seemed to vibrate in resonance with his fear, and the whispers demanded action. Unlock the past, embrace your inheritance, join the tower. In his journal, Jonathan wrote of strange compulsions, to ascend the spiral staircase at specific hours, to trace the carvings on the walls, to handle the artifacts as instructed by the whispers. Each action intensified the tower's grip on him, bending his perception of space and time. Hallways twisted, staircases looped impossibly, and windows showed impossible landscapes, cliffs that stretched into infinity, oceans teeming with shadowy forms, skies swirling in unnatural hues. By the second week, the supernatural influence reached a crescendo. Jonathan discovered a sealed compartment beneath the lantern platform, containing a brass key and a letter addressed to him in the handwriting of a long-deceased ancestor. The letter described the family curse. Every Hale who assumed the lighthouse's keepership became part of its memory, trapped in a liminal space between life and death, contributing their consciousness to the tower itself. The key was said to unlock the final chamber, the heart of the lighthouse, where the inheritance would be fulfilled. Despite the knowledge of his likely fate, Jonathan felt compelled to proceed. The whispers were irresistible, promising understanding, unity with his ancestors, and a kind of immortality within the stone walls. As he ascended to the lantern room with the key, the lighthouse seemed to respond, floors creaking, walls breathing, shadows coalescing into solid shapes. The mirror glowed with an ethereal light, and the spectral ancestors now appeared clearer, guiding him toward the final chamber. When he used the key to unlock the hidden door beneath the lantern platform, Jonathan entered a space unlike any other. A circular chamber lined with mirrors, each reflecting distorted versions of himself and the lighthouse. Shadows of past keepers moved in unison with him, whispering secrets, repeating actions, and demonstrating the inevitability of the curse. The air was thick with a tangible presence, oppressive and alive. As Jonathan stepped further in, he realized the inheritance was not merely symbolic, it was a literal merging with the lighthouse. His consciousness, destined to become part of its memory, joining the lineage of keepers who had vanished before him. The final moments were disorienting and horrifying. Jonathan felt his body dissolve into the mirrors, his mind fracturing as he became aware of centuries of consciousness trapped within the stone. The whispers became a singular chorus, enveloping him completely. Welcome home. The tower remembers. You belong. His last coherent thought was a realization of complete surrender. He was no longer Jonathan Hale. He was part of the lighthouse, a guardian, a memory, a whisper. When villagers later visited Ravencliff Point, they noticed the lighthouse glowing faintly, a soft light pulsing from the lantern room, even during the day. Occasional figures could be glimpsed through the windows, indistinct, fleeting, almost human. Those who approached reported hearing whispers of guidance, warnings, and lamentations, yet no one could stay long enough to comprehend them fully. The tower remained operational for maritime purposes, but no keeper could endure the inheritance without losing their sense of self entirely. The tale of Jonathan Hale became the latest chapter in the lighthouse's dark history. Stories circulated among locals about the cursed inheritance, about the mirrors, the artifacts, and the whispers that bound keepers to the tower. Paranormal enthusiasts and historians who attempted to study the lighthouse reported overwhelming dread, hallucinations, and inescapable compulsions. Ravencliff Point Lighthouse had fulfilled its purpose once more. It claimed its keeper, added his consciousness to the ancient memory embedded in its walls, and waited patiently for the next heir to inherit the curse. Even today, the lighthouse stands as a monument to the price of curiosity and the consequences of familial legacy. Those who listen carefully may hear faint whispers carried by the wind, telling the story of Jonathan Hale and the generations of keepers who became one with the stone. Ravencliff Point remains both a warning and a fascination, a place where the line between life and memory is thin, and where the inheritance of the lighthouse is absolute, inevitable, and eternal.